You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your confidently ignorant host, Abraham.
And I'm your diagnosing everybody after my first abnormal psychology class, host Shane.
Ooh, very good. We are a psychology podcast. We talk about the things that we do in psychology or in behavior and the things that humans do and animals. And sometimes we talk about things that we do badly. And one of those things is estimating our own skills sometimes. But this is actually a nostalgia episode. This means that we previously recorded this episode on July 17th, 2019 is when this was published on the Dunning-Kruger effect.
This is one of my favorite topics because it's just so astounding how confident. I wish I had the amount of confidence that people have when they don't know things.
Ignorance is bliss, as they say.
You know, that's what I'm thinking. Like, this intelligence is a curse, really.
Disagree, but that's okay. So how these work, these nostalgia episodes work, is that we are going to replay the entire original episode, and then we are going to tack on a wee bit of discussion at the end, adding some new stuff or some new takes or some new information or whatever to the end of the episode, so that it's not just a replay entirely, but you also get some new content as well. I would like to say that if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. Thank you for being here. We typically release our full-length episodes on Wednesdays. We release a sort of short-form mini episode on Mondays. And every once in a while, a few times a year, we'll release a previously recorded episode, which is the case now. This is, as I mentioned, one that we published originally in 2019, and we'll be expanding a little bit on it at the end of the replay section of this.
Yes, absolutely.
But before we do all of that, it is September 11th, which means we have some holidays or like days of remembrance to acknowledge, and one of them is that it's September 11th. This is the September 11th day of remembrance. Has been 23 years, I guess, since the original event of September 11th, 9/11.
Yep.
So worth keeping that in our minds.
It's also Emergency Number Day.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's I want to start my own business day. Sure. Go out and do it.
Yeah, I mean, sure. It's Libraries Remember Day, which is concerning. Like, how much do they remember?
I was just wondering. I was like, are we supposed to remember libraries, or is this libraries holding on to like scandalous information?
I think it's the latter to me.
Oh, no.
That's how I understood that. Oh, no.
Well, fortunately, their knowledge stopped several decades ago when people stopped going to libraries, so at least they're a little out of date.
Especially here in Florida.
Yeah, they're empty now. The memories are hollow. It is Make Your Bed Day.
Yes, it is. It's the National Day of Service and Remembrance Day.
All of that makes a lot of sense. It's National Emergency Responder Day. I see a theme emerging here.
Yeah, there's a few of them. It's National Hot Cross Bun Day.
It's National No News is Good News Day, which again seems related.
Yeah, I'd like to avoid it, I guess. It's Odd Day, which is interesting because the last Odd Day was 9/11/2013.
Wait, how could this be Odd Day if it's 9/11/2024?
I don't know. That's what it said.
Okay, sure. Maybe it's
that's what
9/11. It's like prime number. I don't know.
While we do some more talking about holidays, let me look this up.
Okay, great. All right. Well, related to all of the other days that it is today. So it's 9/11 Remembrance, Emergency Number, Day of Service and Remembrance, No News is Good News, and Patriot Day, and Freedom Day. Remember Freedom Day. So we have all of them all lumped together.
Yes. It's also Women's Baseball Day, which is wonderful. So go watch A League of Their Own.
Yeah.
What a great movie.
There's no crying in baseball.
No, there's not. There is no evidence that Odd Day is real, by the way.
Okay. It's
that's
just
odd
and
right now.
It happens irregularly, and that's what makes it odd.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Maybe it's because it was 11 years ago, and 11's an odd number. I don't know, man.
Ooh, I don't know.
It is Direct Support Professional Week.
Yes. It is International Air Ambulance Week.
It is International Housekeepers Week.
Ooh. It's Line Dance Week as well. Terrible week.
There's interesting stuff about line dances. They've tried to make that like a national dance or a state dance a bunch of times. It is National Assisted Living Week.
It's National Biscuits and Gravy Week, which I love.
It is National Environmental Services Week.
And it is National Suicide Prevention Week to go along with Suicide Prevention Month.
It is also National Quiet Day, I found out, which kind of makes sense.
Oh. And here we are talking loudly into this thing.
I know, it's so loud. And it is Fair Trade Fortnight. And also apparently Sexual Health Week.
Oh, great. It's so many things.
Taraji P. Henson's birthday and Ludacris's birthday.
Oh, good. Okay. They're both great.
Anyway,
what a week.
We do talk about the holidays. I know there's a lot going on today and this week and this month. Apparently, I didn't know this, but September is the most popular birth month. Most people are born in September.
Yeah, everybody's bringing in the new year with a bang, if you know what I mean.
That's right.
So, Happy National Sex Health Week.
Right, yeah. We do talk about these holidays for sort of fun thing to do, but also what we come here to do is talk about psychology things, which I think that I said before, but we are a psychology podcast.
Yes.
But we're revisiting this episode about the Dunning-Kruger effect, one of the more popular and well-known about effects in all of psychology, I would guess.
I think so, but I mean, that's us thinking that we know more about this than we do.
That's a very good point. Yeah, I should not be so confident in my my assumptions here. But what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and jump into this episode. We're going to play it in its entirety, and then at the end, we're going to come back and we're going to add a little bit of context. I already said all of that, but just as a reminder, before I do that, I will tell you really quick that if you like what you hear today and would like to support us, you can join us on Patreon, pick up some merch, leave us a rating and a review, like, subscribe, tell a friend, maybe invent a psychological construct, and then name it after us if it's a positive information disseminating one. Yeah. But that's what we're doing here. So anyway, please enjoy this now 5-year-old episode about the Dunning-Kruger effect. And then at the end, we will update you on some new stuff that we found. All right, this is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
So welcome to Why We Do What We Do,
your favorite consumable psychology podcast.
All right, Shane, we need to just jump right into this because I have a story I'm very excited to tell you and audience tell you. This is so far my favorite story that I've been able to tell. So I hope I do it justice. I don't want to overhype it too much, but I think it'll be fun. Okay. So let's set the stage for someone whose name is MacArthur Wheeler. And maybe you've already heard this story, maybe not, but it's a great name to begin with already. MacArthur Wheeler. Okay.
Yeah.
It's 1994, 1995, and we're in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Great city.
And yeah, great city. And we're going to imagine here that, so we've got little MacArthur. I'm not entirely sure how old he is at this point. He's probably in his mid-20s or so. And maybe he's got this older brother who is like communicating with people through these pieces of paper. And MacArthur's like, I'm going to find out what's going on here. So he grabs a piece of paper and it's completely blank. And he later learns that there was a hidden message on the piece of paper that was written in invisible ink. Now, I just made up all that stuff about his brother. I have no idea. But either way, he learned about this idea that messages can be hidden on a piece of paper by writing them in lemon juice, right?
Okay.
You write them on lemon juice, and what happens is that the lemon juice just blends right into the paper. It looks like it's not even there. And then what happens is if you hold that paper over some kind of light or heating source, probably not like a flame because it'll just burn the paper. The paper is pretty flammable.
Generally.
But you hold it over something like low heat like a light, what it does is that it'll actually oxidize the lemon juice and it'll turn the juice brown, and then it can now be red. So that's this whole idea of the invisible ink, sort of where that comes from. Okay. So the budding scientist that MacArthur Wheeler was, he was intrigued and inspired the power that the lemons had to create this invisible ink, right? And unfortunately, he then found himself pretty soon after that in a situation where he really needed some cash. I'm guessing to pay off his espionage and scientific training because he's intrigued in these things.
Of course.
But regardless, whatever it was, he found that he really needed some cash. And so he decided to go out and buy a bunch of lemons because he had a plan. And so on April 19th, 1995, the middle of the day, Wheeler walks into a bank, pulls out a gun, and demands the money.
So did he squirt lemon juice in their eyes or something?
No.
Okay, so I need to know how these lemons work. Like, what's the deal with the lemons?
I'm getting there. But he wasn't done yet. After he robs that bank, he goes into another bank and does the exact same thing. Not squirting lemon juice in their eyes, but he has purchased all these lemons. We'll get to in a moment. Now, interestingly, the bankers may have been a little bit confused at how much Wheeler was sort of cringing and blinking while he's there. And we'll come into this, okay? So why are the lemons relevant? Well, MacArthur was not actually wearing any kind of mask or disguise or hiding his voice or face in any way whatsoever. And it's the middle of the day on a regular day of week. And I mean, it's 1995, which at this point was quite a while ago, but even back then, banks had security cameras. And in fact, Wheeler knew that they had security cameras. Interestingly, then the police, of course, see the security footage. They identify who the person is who robbed these banks, and they arrive at his home to arrest him. And they even show him some of the videos saying, like, you robbed a bank. Here's a video of you robbing the bank. And what do you think that he maybe said?
Oh, I could imagine he would say something like, how did you know it was me? Or like, how did you see me?
Yeah, you're actually not as far off as I thought you might be. What he said is, but I wore the juice. And the police here are kind of confused by that response, as you might imagine. You see, and you maybe figured this out as I was talking about it, MacArthur Wheeler reasoned that because this lemon juice can work to make invisible ink, it must be the properties of lemons that grant this invisibility. And so he explains to the police that he had rubbed lemon juice all over his face before robbing the banks because the lemon juice, he believed, made him invisible. And that there was no way people could identify him, and the cameras wouldn't be able to see him because he would be invisible because he had lemon juice on his face.
That is one of the best things I've ever heard.
And so, of course, the very first thing they said is if he says, okay, I rubbed lemon juice on my face, then the cops sort of thought maybe he's on drugs or maybe he's drunk or something, not totally sure. No, he was not. He was just that wrong. He apparently even said that he had tested it by taking a picture of himself with lemon juice on his face and claimed that he couldn't see himself in the picture.
Really?
Which leads me to speculate a little bit in terms of what may have happened here that could have been the effect. My first guess is that he actually had the camera pointed away from him. And so that when he took the picture and he wasn't in it, it's because the camera wasn't pointed at him at all. My second guess is that he did point the camera toward him, but pointed it so far out of the way that he couldn't actually see himself. And my third guess, I don't actually even know what else could be another option here. Those are the only two that make any sense.
That's
to me.
amazing.
I know. Now, hilariously, he even, and as I mentioned before, he reported that the lemon juice had made the robberies difficult because the lemon juice had been getting in his eyes and he was stinging his eyes as he was trying to rob the banks.
That's why he was blinking.
Exactly. That's why he was blinking and cringing. He was easily convicted and sent to jail, as you might imagine.
Oh my God. So, that's one of the best things I've ever heard. Like, legitimately. So how does he explain lemonade?
I know, right? And I also was thinking, I'm like, do you really believe that you're the first person in all of human history? If this had been true, let's say lemons actually make you invisible. You're the first person in human history to figure this out and try and use it for nefarious reasons. Like, wouldn't armies be like growing lemon orchards in like gigantic acres to cover their soldiers in lemon juice so that they could like go sneak onto territory? Like, who wouldn't have capitalized on this if that was a thing?
Yeah, soldiers from Florida would have been unstoppable. There's so much citrus here.
Those Floridian soldiers, that's right. Yeah, maybe it's just citrus generally speaking. Maybe even eating it makes you invisible. I don't know. So
that's amazing.
All right. So anyway, yeah, I just had to share that story. And this is actually going to factor in even more relevant when we start talking about what we're talking about today, which I haven't announced yet, but we're going to get to in just a moment. First, moving on from the exciting story that we just told, Shane, how good of a driver do you think you are compared to other drivers?
I think I'm a pretty good driver. Like, I think it depends on your definition of good. I would argue that I'm a very safe driver.
Okay, fair enough. Did you know that, I'm giving you the statistics a little bit wrong here, but it's something like 90% of people believe that they're better drivers than 90% of people?
That's amazing. That's so 90% of people think they're in that top 10% of good drivers.
Yes. Okay. That have been surveyed. That is to say that people kind of radically overestimate how good of a driver they really are, right?
Yeah.
And I have a story about myself as well. I think the theme is starting to become a little bit more clear here as we're going through this. But when I was learning to play the drums, I remember thinking that I was the greatest thing ever at it. And then I started listening to really, really good drummers. And I started learning really, really difficult music and discovered I'm not that good at playing the drums, at least when I was picking up. And I certainly got a lot better, but certainly am not in like the top 10 drummers of all time. I just, I got proficient enough that I could play the drums well and would be able to navigate them like anybody who spent a lot of time learning to play the drums. And then another one example for myself is coming right out of undergrad. I believed that I knew just about everything that there was to know in the field that I had studied in. And then I went to graduate school, and realized that I knew very, very little. And the longer I was in graduate school, the more I realized how little I really knew about the scope and depth of the field that I belong to. And I feel like I've heard this story from other people as well, that the more you know, the more you realize how little you know. And that's kind of a thing. There's so many good examples of this that I think if you look at Steve Carell's character on the American version of The Office, he plays Michael Scott. He's someone who often seems to think that he knows a lot about things and makes hilariously stupid mistakes because he thinks he knows too much. The character Jason on the show The Good Place is also someone who is portrayed as being incredibly stupid, but like is overly confident. They describe as having massively unearned confidence and just thinking that he knows a lot about what he's going to do. And he ends up, this is sort of a spoiler if you haven't seen the show, so skip ahead about 10 seconds, but he ends up dying because he locks himself in a safe while wearing a scuba mask, thinking that the scuba mask is going to help him breathe while he's in the safe, even though there's no air hole out of the safe or anything. And then there's the story I just mentioned about MacArthur Wheeler. There's this effect that people will speak with conviction, loudly, emotionally, and with authority and boisterous claims, unconcerned about how little they really know about something. And it turns out that this effect that I've been describing for the last 10 minutes and in great detail actually has a name. And interestingly, and this was just a coincidence, but this year just happens to be the 20-year anniversary of the publication of this effect. And I want to make sure, because we're talking about this, that we were careful to avoid sounding like we know too much about this for today's discussion, so that we avoid falling victim to the tendency to overestimate how much we really know about this. And this is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Okay?
Yes. I feel like being on this podcast has made me realize how little I know. So thankfully I'm self-aware enough to recognize that. This effect is pretty interesting to see. Like, you see people really, really dig into stuff and you're like, that is not even close to accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. So this falls under a category of what might be called cognitive bias. And so this is essentially a thing that people often tend to do that is biased toward a particular, I guess, tendency that may or may not, well, in this case, is not accurate usually. When we talk about these types of cognitive biases, they tend to be something that is a mistake in a way of thinking, or sort of a logical error in one's thinking. And one of the foundational pieces about the Dunning-Kruger effect is another psychological process or bias called confirmation bias. And this is basically what it sounds like, okay? Essentially, the gist of this is that we can't possibly know everything in the world. So we learn about, we learn what we can, as much as we can, when we can, and we can be fairly selective in what we choose to learn, while still spending a lot of time and effort on that sliver of information that we chose to take on. Now, because of this, we can have the impression that we have really done our due diligence in learning about our topic of interest. And confirmation bias is when we then look for information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs, and we ignore or dismiss any irrelevant information that contradicts our pre-existing beliefs, and we only recall in a way that allows us to feel more correct about those beliefs. And so the reason that these are related is because as we go about learning things, as I said, we're going to just we have to choose what we're going to learn. There are some things about which we can learn everything there is to know, but there are a lot of things that we can't. And so when we only choose those things that confirm the beliefs that we already have, then we are falling victim to that confirmation bias. A very clear example of this are the flat earthers.
Oh, flat earthers.
Yeah.
They have members all around the globe. Did you know that?
That's right. Yeah, I remember you telling me that. And I had recently watched the documentary that is at the time of this recording on Netflix called Beyond the Curve, which is a great documentary. And in this, you see this so clearly, where there is an abundance of information that the earth is not flat. So much that I I can't really wrap my head around the position that they take, but they will specifically ignore all of that, downplay it, give it some very bizarre explanation for how it's the case, and they only will accept information that confirms their pre-existing opinion. UFO hunters, same exact thing.
Yeah, and like in visiting mediums, and there's a lot of different, and I feel like these are examples of people that seem like they have like more outlandish types of beliefs. Like we talk about like ghost hunters and stuff like that, and how it just kind of like perpetuates Bigfoot, like all the cryptozoology stuff, like, which is really interesting to see. But it's not like, what ends up happening is people kind of talk in an echo chamber, right? Like they kind of like, they collaborate and they corroborate with people that share those same opinions, and they kind of back and forth confirm each other, and then and eventually it turns into this big thing. Now, and these are kind of more like funny or like less harmful, I would say, types of examples, but you see this in like American politics right now, very specifically. Nobody can have like a conversation about discourse when you're talking about different political ideologies. Like nobody can really have that conversation because of they speak in these echo chambers, and they kind of confirm their own things, even though data might present something else.
Yeah, I mean, you see people who will make arguments for and against immigration, and they will only accept information that confirms their opinion about that thing, or for and against GMOs, or for and against vaccines. And like some of these things, there's relatively clear scientific information that backs up those things. Now, all of this is just talking about confirmation bias, because we need to get into the actual Dunning-Kruger effect thing. But the point of this is that this tends to be pretty emotionally charged, and often about these controversial topics, as you had mentioned. And so people will get, when they're that emotionally invested in something, then they will absolutely dig in their heels and put their backs up against the wall in terms of refusing to admit an alternative to their position.
Absolutely. And it just kind of snowballs from there. So it becomes a little bit of a problem, because then they just kind of like their opinion flies in the face of, or like their perceived facts fly in the face of like what's the actual truth.
Before we talk about whatever the next thing will be, let's do some ads. All right, getting back to what we're doing. So let's go ahead and get into the background of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Now, if you were to actually read the original article, the very first paragraph describes the story about MacArthur Wheeler. And so there is, I saw some sources that actually indicated that the entire research line that was spawned by the Dunning-Kruger effect was in fact inspired by the incredible level of confidence that MacArthur Wheeler must have had when he went in to rob those banks. And so these two psychologists, Dunning and Kruger, I'll talk about more in a second, they actually set out to do some experiments on this effect of this sort of high confidence, low competence and human bias that led to Wheeler's unfortunate decision. Now, about 4 years after Wheeler's story, so we're now in 1999, we have Dr. David Dunning, and he deigned to disseminate with his graduate student, Justin Kruger, and they published a paper outlining the effect that was observed with respect to this overconfidence thing.
Yeah, and so this paper that they put out in 1999 was called Unskilled and Unaware of It, How Difficulties in Recognizing One's Own Incompetence Lead to Inflated Self-Assessments, which is just such a great title.
Isn't that so good? Like,
that's so good.
Scientific papers do not need to have these boring and dull titles like that. This is like one of the most highly cited publication ever, and it has this awesome title.
So have you seen that thing in academia where you say Harry Potter and that's like a new movie, like Harry Potter and the Unskilled and Unaware of It, how difficult, like this one doesn't fit as well, but some of them do, and you're like, oh, that's good.
No,
like,
that's awesome. I love it.
Harry Potter and the self-assessment of incompetence among those with Dunning-Kruger effect. Like, you know, it might be something like that. It's pretty cool.
There you go. All right. So this effect, as it's clear now, and as I mentioned earlier, has become famous and known appropriately enough as the Dunning-Kruger effect. And their original paper described 4 experiments used to examine the effect. So let's go ahead and dive into those experiments.
All right, so as part of these 4 experiments, they tested humor, grammar, logical, and calibrating competence. So they kind of tested all these things. And in the first experiment, 65 participants were asked how good they were at judging whether or not something could be perceived as funny, which is great because I think things are hilarious. So that I would be a participant in this. And then asked to do that very thing. So those participants who presumed to be among the greatest judges of humor performed worse than all the other participants, whereas those that guessed that they weren't exceptional judges but were actually pretty knowledgeable about the content, or they actually performed pretty well, or at least closer to that predicted level across subjects.
Yeah, Now, I think you might be able to look at this and immediately recognize, well, humor is pretty subjective, and whether or not someone does well at being funny is going to depend on their audience and various other sort of subjective interpretations. And the authors recognize this, and so concerned with that subjectivity of something like humor, and interested in seeing whether they could replicate those results with a different group, they chose a more sort of objective test to try their experiment again in a different domain. So in experiment 2, they had 45 undergraduate students, of course, because where else would you get your population from?
Right.
And they told those students that they were taking a logic/reasoning test. And then after the test, they were asked to estimate their logic/reasoning ability compared to the other students specifically. So how well do you think that you did compared to the other students who would also take this test? And also how well they did compared to other people taking the test and how many of the answers they actually got correctly. So they were like, how good do you think you are at logic and reasoning? How much better at this do you think, or how well do you think you did at this compared to other students? How many do you think you got correct? Those are sort of the 3 ways that they asked them. This study produced one of the most famous graphs ever. Actually, all of these experiments have very similar graphs, but this one in particular I saw being used in other publications elsewhere, in which it's clearly observed that on average, participants rated themselves at least on par with much more competent students and then performed at the bottom 25th percentile, the bottom quartile of the entire distribution, whereas students who were more competent actually rated themselves about the same, and even in some cases less than those other students, than the least competent performers, and they actually did much better than they guessed that they would do. So those people who what you saw is that people rated themselves fairly similarly in terms of what they expected, but the highest performers actually really outperformed where they rated themselves, and the lowest performers way overestimated how well their performance was. Now, those people that did know quite a bit more about the subject, they were closer to their actual performance, but they still did underrate themselves a little bit.
I love that it just speaks to the idea that, like, besides the fact that people overestimate their competence, that there are people who are competent that way underestimate it too. Like, I like that there's that other side of the coin. Like, I think that's pretty interesting. I feel like that's probably where maybe the discussion around imposter syndrome gets sparked a little bit. Like,
ooh, I like that.
You know. So experiment 3 followed basically the same format, and this time with 84 undergrad participants. So they had a pretty big pool of undergrads. That's great. Like,
right.
Lucky for them. And so the results were very similar to the first 2 tests. And then they did a follow-up that they called Takes One to Know One.
I just love their titles. They're so good.
I love that they're they're just very human scientists. Like, that's so great.
Yeah.
In the Takes One to Know One follow-up, what they did was they asked the lowest and highest performing students to grade these tests from other students by answering how many they thought the other students had answered correctly. So that's so good.
Right? Isn't that clever?
And then they received their own tests back and were asked to guess how well they performed relative to the test they had graded.
So this one's just getting at a little bit deeper dive on how people would rate themselves in comparison to others, and giving them sort of another way of looking at it when they not only do they just guess how well they perform, but they actually look at other performance and then try and guess how well they perform.
This is such a deep dive on this. So great. So the low performers increased their perceived performance of themselves on average, unable to recognize their own weaknesses, and became even less accurate at gauging their abilities. So they found that, like, those people who are low performers were still not able to recognize their own weaknesses.
Well, and they almost doubled down on it too. So they went from, like, they already thought that they were pretty hot stuff. Then they looked at everyone else's tests. Incidentally, some of those tests where people did much better than they did. And then they're like, wow, I really am a genius. And thought that they were even better after that, even though these were the low, like these in the bottom 25th percentile performance wise.
Right. And then the high performers did also increase their personal estimations as well, because they could better calibrate their performance and became more accurate in their ability to gauge their performance. So the higher performance were able to kind of get closer to that mark.
Right. So they sort of undersold themselves initially, but then as they got to actually compare their performance to others, they had a better system by which they could actually evaluate their own performance, because they had the appropriate level of competence needed to make that estimation, whereas otherwise they tend to guess pretty conservatively. Now that they have more information, they can make a good educated guess. Low performers, on the other hand, are like straight out of Idiocracy. They're like, I am flying high because the world is my oyster. And like, even though they're wrong about basically everything, they're like, I'm going to stick to my guns because I can. And that was not a comment on firearms, by the way. That was stick to my guns as in hold my ground. But all right.
Yeah.
finally, in experiment 4, I honestly was not trying to make a pun there. I was legitimately concerned that people thought I was making a political statement. Anyway, in experiment 4, this was essentially another type of logic test. This time they got up to 140 undergraduate students and basically had the same results as before. So essentially they replicated this 3 times. They got 4 different studies showing about the same thing with respect to those people who, when they had a high level of confidence, they would vastly overestimate how well they actually were at performing. Dunning said, quote, "Ignorant people do not recognize, scratch that, cannot recognize just how incompetent they are," end quote. And so he's sort of encapsulating the effects here. He also had a few more quotes I really liked that I'm actually not sure that these were all from the article. I found these in various places and I just kind of grabbed them as I saw them because they all were so good. Another quote, and his name was Dr. David Dunning, again, just to make sure people are out there. He said, quote, "What's curious is that, in many cases, incompetence does not leave people disoriented, perplexed, or cautious. Instead, the incompetent are often blessed with an inappropriate confidence, buoyed by something that feels to them like knowledge." End quote. Isn't that so good?
I love how it's basically just saying like stupid people. I shouldn't say stupid. They're not stupid because these could be smart people. They just are. Right. So let me rephrase that. People that literally don't know about a particular bit of information will like lean so heavily into something that they feel like is knowledge, like that they feel like they know it. They lean so hard into it that they're not like, nah, maybe I don't know.
I had an idea for a shirt for why we do what we do that looked like a multiple choice test. And it was like they answered almost every question. And one of the options was, "It feels right." And I was like, incorrect. That's not
and that's a lot of what this is.
Right. Yeah, exactly. You'll have those people who like, well, it makes logical or intuitive sense, or it feels right to me. It has that truthiness thing to it to have it be this way. So I'm going to lean into this full tilt and really hold my ground. And although the study was not designed to show this one effect specifically, the effect that I'm about to say is that what often happens is that when someone declares a position on something, they will often find themselves compelled to defend that position tooth and nail, even though they have no reason to believe that position is a legitimate one. Yeah. And then they will go through that confirmation bias cycle where they look for every conceivable piece of information they can to make them feel right about that position they arbitrarily chose in the first place. It's kind of incredible.
It's not like and I slipped up before. This is not stupid people. They can be very incredibly smart people. And so he actually has a quote specific to that. Did you want to take that?
Oh, you can do it if you want.
He goes on to say, quote, "An ignorant mind is precisely not a spotless, empty vessel, but one that's filled with the clutter of irrelevant or misleading life experiences, theories, facts, intuitions, strategies, algorithms, heuristics, metaphors, and hunches that regrettably have the look and feel of useful and accurate knowledge." So essentially what he's saying is there's all this information that sounds good, it feels right, and they're not people that are dumb. They're taking that information, they're synthesizing that information that they have and turning it into an argument or a position that's not quite accurate.
And I mean, that almost feels like politics in a nutshell to me. Like this is where people will get on major controversial topics. They will have a lot of quote unquote information about that topic. And as he said, it's not that they're stupid and it's not that their mind is empty. It's that it is filled with the wrong stuff. And being filled with the wrong stuff has the impression of being well informed, but it's not it's informed in a way, but it's not well informed. It's not meaningfully informed.
It's not accurately informed even.
Yes, exactly.
Another thing that's part of that is it becomes so well formed that it becomes almost static, and that's part of the issue too. Is it's with new facts and new information, people don't budge on their position. So when they create these ideas or when they create this like body of knowledge, it doesn't move, and that's part of the problem with this too. Is it's less about how people kind of come into all this, but more about how when they dig their heels in, they don't get out of it.
Yeah, I mean, so one way to summarize this, and I'm not actually pulling this from the source material, I made this up, but one thing that the theme that really occurred to me as I was looking through this research is to summarize this by saying that people don't know what they don't know. when you don't have a frame of reference for this, then you don't know that you don't have a frame of reference for this. And there is potentially a world's worth of knowledge of things that you don't even know that you don't know. Like an example of this, I have frequently heard people talk about the field of study that I went into. And someone even specifically said to me, how is there a whole degree that you can get on that? How is there more than like a class worth or even like a day of a class worth of subject for that material? And it's because they're so oblivious to the things that to which they've had so little exposure, and apparently believe that their experiences have encompassed the vast majority of the human experience that one can have, that they don't even know that that is something that they don't know that they're missing. And that's true for me as well. Like I might look at a field, like there is probably a whole field of people that just study like paint texture. I'm just making that up. I don't actually know if that's a thing, but like I would think like, how much is there really to know about that? That seems like such a simple topic, and be completely wrong. And again, I don't know if that's actually a thing, but there are going to be fields like that where it seems to me that seems like something you could learn from a 5-minute YouTube video. And actually, there are people who will spend years researching and studying and learning everything there is to know about that subject. And I wouldn't even know that that was something I was missing.
When I started studying in my doctoral program, they basically said that you develop this level of knowledge that you get a very specific understanding about a very specific topic to such a fine point that you end up being the only person in the world that really understands that topic to that depth. I mean, you're talking about 7 billion people, and you're the person that knows about that particular topic. Like when you do your dissertation, you are the expert on that topic at that point in time. And even then, you're not even really the expert.
Yeah.
And there's still plenty to learn about that particular pinpoint of study.
Right.
So you thought you were listening to a podcast and you were confident in that, but what you were not confident in is how many ads there were going to be. Surprise, here's a new one. And we're back.
There is a little bit of hubris in here in thinking that whoever it is, and it could be me or you or anybody, where you sort of think, well, I've learned enough about the world that I know all the things, at least generally the categories of things that there are to know. And so part of the point of this is really just to illuminate, like be open and willing to acknowledge the fact that there might be things out there that you don't know that you're missing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's perfectly appropriate. So that's kind of the thing about all this is it's not just those stupid people who fall victim to this. Like we're all pretty good at a small handful of things, right? Like we all have our own experience. I think Bill Nye said specifically, you can learn something new from every person that you meet. Like I think that's one of the best things I've ever heard. Like I love that. And it's really great because every person you meet is pretty good at a small handful of things. And we are good at calibrating ourselves with respect to those things. Like we can kind of understand where we're at, but ultimately what's going to happen is that we're not going to be an expert in many other things. Like I play bass guitar. I've been playing for 20 years now. I'm not anywhere near being an expert, and I've been playing for most of my life.
Not as good as Flea.
And I'm never going to be as good as Flea. That's absurd to think. Like, that is a stretch goal, if you will. I'm just never going to contact that.
Meta reference.
Yeah, you like that? So every brilliant, incomprehensibly genius erudite will lack some knowledge about something and will fail to know what they don't know about whatever subject they are not an expert in. Everybody, all of us have this. We cannot possibly know all of the things.
Yeah, this is a human thing. This is just, and the point of this, again, is to just be made more aware of our biases that are out there so that at the very least, we can acknowledge that we maybe don't know as much as we think and maybe be slightly more hesitant about making and really holding our ground on claims that we maybe are missing information about, and at least be open to new information about that thing.
Absolutely. I like that. I like the way that sounds. That's nice.
Thanks. All right, so let's go ahead and get into how this works and why it works and that sort of thing. I mean, we sort of already did elaborate on this a bit, but I think we can really elaborate on this in just a different way that might make it easy to understand, or at least just approach it in a way that helps sort of cement it in place. And this is essentially as simple as a logic comparison task, or that's the way you can sort of frame it. And so let me say a little bit more about that. Most animals with the ability to sense things, especially visually, can tell the difference between concrete comparisons, such as this thing is bigger than this thing, right?
Right.
Now, there's a smaller number of animals in the world that can tell the difference between semantic and arbitrary comparisons, such as this thing is more valuable than this thing. Okay.
That's why we put fancy rocks in jewelry.
Exactly. That's exactly it. that is why we hold these little rocks and we will pay exorbitant amounts of money for them, is because we can look at that and someone said, this is worth a lot more than all the other rocks. And we will go, okay, here is all my money. And then, and so that's, anyway, that was a excessively political stance on jewelry. The Dunning-Kruger effect is the extent to which we make comparisons to things that we don't even know exist. And we tend to underestimate how vast those things are, or at least they might be. And so ancient people likely believed that the moon was fairly small and just a few, I don't know, maybe a few hundred or a few thousand miles off the ground, because they really lacked any context or reason to believe that it was otherwise, right? And so this is just the ability to arbitrarily compare what they knew to what they were seeing. They just didn't have the information. Just for clarification, the moon is 230,000 miles away ish. It varies, but it's around that. So it's quite a bit more than you might guess if it's like, wow, that moon must be 100 miles away. It's a bit more. Yeah.
It's a few more. I mean, and just to kind of like further elaborate on that too, like that's you're talking about like astral bodies and all that, but I mean, how much is there to know about rabbit poop? Like, I literally don't know. I have no idea, but there's a whole study. I mean, there are people that treat coprophagia. Like, there are people that they're experts in poop, and they're experts in specific types of poop.
Yeah. There's probably a lot more to know about this than immediately seems to make sense.
Right. Absolutely. It's just to kind of like press the issue a little bit more. Like, how much is there to know about installing plumbing? I mean, there are entire professions dedicated to this particular trade, right? And you know, there's so much to know when you're looking at any sort of plumbing. And there, maybe we know a few tasks like how to unclog a drain, or how to, you know, maybe dial a phone so that somebody else can come unclog the drain. I'm not very handy myself.
Yeah, same.
There's just a lot of stuff that goes into something as particular as a particular skill set or particular trade. And that within itself continually evolves, right? So to me, plumbers are just these really cool magicians.
Yeah. Basically, I've tried to take on some home projects myself and thought that, like, well, how difficult can it be to install this sink or whatever? And turns out it's enormously difficult and something that I would rather never do again, if possible. And so it makes me wonder. I'm like, man, as someone whose job it is to do this, how do you get so good? Like, this thing just seems basically impossible at first glance to me. And again, that's just me highlighting how little I know about that field.
Yeah, when I was in high school, I took an electronics class and learned how to like rewire a wall. But then I had to like install an outlet somewhere in my house not too long ago, and I was so paranoid. I was like, I had to go get like a rubber-handled screwdriver and turn off all the fuses in the house just to install one thing. I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, I literally don't know enough to be safe. I'm gonna end up like electrocuting myself.
I think there's actually an important point there: is you don't know enough to be safe. That's something we should maybe come back to.
Yeah, no, for sure. So we don't know enough to be safe. So don't just be aware. Just be aware of what you try to be aware of what you don't know.
Just don't.
just don't. Ask for help.
Yeah. So yeah, the more things you learn, the more you're exposed to, the better able you will be to understand the limits of your own knowledge and your competence in something.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's always a few interesting tidbits and considerations that are fun to pepper into a discussion like this. So one thing is that the Dunning-Kruger effect could be described as a form of the overconfidence effect. In fact, I actually had a difficult time telling exactly how these things were different, except it does seem that the Dunning-Kruger effect identified the aspect of the correlation that confidence is reciprocally related to competence, whereas the overconfidence effect really only seems to describe the tendency to overestimate one's ability. And that was the example I gave of 90% of people think they're better drivers than 50 or 90% of other people. And it's true of a lot of other things as well. And actually that had me evaluate my own driving, and I decided I must be perfectly average. I think I might actually be a little bit less than average. And I'm thinking about like stunt drivers and people who are professional drivers are probably really, really good at it. And I am perfectly capable of navigating a car without getting in an accident most of the time. But I would guess that probably the best place to put myself is right smack dab in the middle if I really were to think about it carefully. And I think that there is this again wasn't explicitly stated in the Dunning-Kruger effect, but this does seem to also be related to the idea that you mentioned earlier of the imposter effect, which is the idea that when you are become more and more and more of an expert in something, sometimes you find yourself feeling like you are kind of a fraud, or you don't really know that much about what you're doing. And this is a thing that happens with people who
achieve a high degree of speciality in a particular subject, they will actually feel a lack of confidence in their competence in that subject because they know how much they don't know.
Absolutely. That makes sense.
So another thing in here is just, this is a way to think about this Dunning-Kruger effect and maybe think about yourself and just have some consideration around this. And the suggestion here is to think of something you're an expert in and how much the average person knows about your area of expertise and how little even that they don't know about your primary subject. And then that is you about everything you're not an expert in.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the thought experiment I'm proposing. And I got this specifically from a book that I'm putting in the show notes called The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe book, where they give this as an example, as a way specifically to address the Dunning-Kruger effect. If you think about how little people know about the thing that you are really good at, now apply that to yourself with respect to everything you're not an expert in, which is going to be most things, right? I am not an expert in the climate. I am not an expert in the oceans. I am not an expert in animals. I am not an expert in plants. I'm not an expert in like computers. I'm not an expert in movies or literature or any of those things. I'm an expert in my field and maybe a little bit in board games. And like, so those things are things that I am very, very, very narrow on. And I feel really confident about those things, but I am utterly average or less than average, or at least moderately incompetent about everything else in the world about which there are experts.
And to kind of further get into that, like you mentioned, like being an expert in your field, like if I walk into a room full of people that have no experience in my field, then technically I'm the expert in my field that's currently present. But there are things in my field that I have never contacted or things that blow my mind. Like I'll pick up a book of something that's in my field and I'm like, what the hell does this even mean?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I've seen those.
So I think that's an important thing too, is like you might be an expert to some degree, and then there's some things that you can always kind of know more about what you know.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Just one other really quick thing is that this idea of the Dunning-Kruger effect is also related to the notion of something called illusory superiority, which is a very similar sort of idea. Just the illusion that you are better at something than you are, or you're the best at something and you're not really the best at something. That's just a general thing. But that's all I had on this. You good to move on to our take-homes?
Yeah, I am good to move on. I think you really nailed it.
Thanks. I think the very first take-home point really should be that there is a massive amount of information that I don't know about this topic. Mm-hmm. And I mean, really digging into this, there have been an avalanche of studies that have followed this, that have explored the ins and outs and the depths of this thing, that continue to be researched because there is so much to know about this topic.
Yeah, I think another one is if you hear about something new that you didn't have any idea existed at all, assume that there is probably a lot more to that thing than you might think at first glance. So it's probably like the tip of the iceberg phenomenon, right? Like where like you kind of come into contact with a little bit of it, but there's so much more to understand about that within our own universe.
Yep. And this is where I get to go a little bit on a soapbox here thing. And I want to just make sure that there's a caveat. One thing that occurred to me as we were talking about this is I could certainly see people who have that confirmation bias who actually use the discussion we have here as evidence to support their confirmation bias about something for which they are wrong. And so an important caveat here is that just because you might not know what you don't know, or you might not know everything about a particular area, does not mean that all ideas that someone proposed are equally valid and therefore should be given equal weight and consideration or deserve an equal amount of attention and resources to understand. Okay. And furthermore, there are people who will gleefully disseminate completely incorrect information, knowing it's incorrect, that makes it appear as though their argument is supported, even though they just made up that information. So, like, here are some very basic things. Homeopathy is not medicine. The earth is round. It was not created 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. The earth is not hollow. Humans have landed on the moon. Drinking boiling water is fatal. Chelation can kill you if you don't need it. Vaccines do not cause autism or other neurological diseases. There are not human spirits floating around as ghosts. The Good Place is, or was at the time of wherever you hear this, an amazing TV show. There is no such thing as Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, and the pyramids in the Easter Island were not built by aliens. These are just things. And just because I say that, and I'm not an expert in those things, does not mean that the alternative hypothesis is actually a tenable, reasonable place to be. often does not make any conceptual sense, and there is often little or no evidence behind it. Okay. It's just, I want to make sure that we really do point out that just because I say I might not be an expert in homeopathy, therefore that is equally valid as a consideration of medicine, is knowing as much as I do about it, which again isn't everything, is enough to know that there's nothing there.
I like Fire Abraham. That was good.
That's right.
You spit hot fire. It's good.
I did.
Yeah,
my microphone melted.
Yeah. Also, I fully support everything you just said. So I endorse that. So if we were politicians and running partners, I would absolutely be like, yeah, what he said. So another thing too to kind of take away from this is like display a little bit of humility. Just displaying humility to look like you're avoiding this effect does not mean your opinion is justified. So again, like going back and saying like, well, I don't know, but maybe vaccines cause all the autism. Like if you're kind of going from that route of like, I don't know at all, but this is kind of what it is. It doesn't really give your opinion any sort of, it doesn't hold any water. Like it does, just because you're being modest about a situation or a particular subject doesn't mean that your opinion is still valid about it. There still needs to be some evidence and support for what you're saying.
Right. I mean, the point is that armed with the information that you might be overestimating your ability or knowledge about something, consider questioning how well you really know that thing and try and find conflicting data and learn how and where you might be wrong. Like that's essentially the scientific process, is to find where do things not work? Where do they break down? Where is information incorrect? What are considerations that haven't actually been included in the research so far? And figure out how to better understand the world by breaking down the assumptions that we have coming into it.
Yeah. So I guess one of the big take homes is if by the end of this episode, you're finding yourself questioning what you believe or what you know, then I think that we've done a pretty good job.
Yeah. As a general rule, I'd recommend that you assume that anything you don't know about or you aren't an expert in, that there is something for you to learn about that subject. And also keeping in mind that caveat that like it should fit within the parameters of general understanding about how the universe works.
Agreed.
All right. I have a couple of really cool quotes to close us out, if you don't mind.
Yeah, let's do it.
So the first one is, quote, "The greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, it's the illusion of knowledge," end quote. And I don't know the source of that one. I think the source is unknown. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Another one would be, the problem with the world is that the intelligent people are full of doubt while the stupid are full of confidence. And that's either by Charles Bukowski or Bertrand Russell. It's hard to find and pin down which one said that.
I saw both from various sources. And yeah, I don't know. It was interesting. And then the last one is, quote, "Ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge," end quote. And that was by Charles Darwin.
Thank you, Charles Darwin.
The well-known Charles Darwin, you might say.
Famously studied Charles Darwin.
Yeah.
I feel good about that.
Awesome.
So
man.
hopefully, so now I know, I don't know what I don't know, and now I'm afraid that what I know is not enough.
Great. Well, hopefully it didn't leave you in any sort of existential crisis, but go out and learn about the world, you know? That'd be my command to myself and you and everyone else.
Yeah, I agree with that. I like that. That's a good charge.
Let's once again disrupt this disseminating and hopefully smart thing that we're doing to bring you something different than that. Ads. All right, we are back. All right, so that was our discussion about the Dunning-Kruger effect, where we sort of covered the history of this, how it works, different things to understand about it. We sort of unpacked the original experiment and all of that. So there has continued to be a decent amount of research on this topic in the sort of psychological sphere. And there have been some people who have been, I think, pushing a somewhat more skeptical view of how robust of an effect this is. Now, a lot of people have replicated this in some version or another, so I think it's reasonable to accept that there is something about this that's there because it has been replicated so many times.
Right.
Um,
But there are also some people who have been pushing back a little bit, saying maybe it's not exactly what we think it is. But let's start with one study that we found that sort of unpacked a different aspect of the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yeah, so one potential reason that people are bad at estimating their performance is that they don't get any feedback or information about themselves. So in a 2013 study, they asked 165 bridge players, which, you know, Apparently people play bridge still. They asked 165 bridge players to estimate their performance in several games and even received feedback on their performance. And despite having explicit knowledge about their performance, the bottom 1/3 of people still overestimated their performance, and highest performing people still underestimated their performance.
So essentially what they were suggesting was, even when you know that you're not accurately estimating your own ability, you will still incorrectly estimate your ability.
Right.
Yeah, and which was a definitely a different take on this, from assuming that like the reason that they don't know that they're as bad at this as they are is because they don't get any feedback on it. And like, no, even when they get feedback, they still think they're better than they are or worse than they are. Again, the lower performers tend to think they're better. The higher performers tend to think that they're worse or underestimate their performance, if you will.
Right.
Now, that does kind of lead to an updated article that I found. I don't believe this was a peer-reviewed article. I believe this was just published online. Nevertheless, they made some interesting points. And this was published in 2023 in Scientific American. And this expresses some skepticism about the sort of strength and robustness of the Dunning-Kruger effect, as I had mentioned before. And really, one of their arguments is that the data collection methods in the experiments, the original one and maybe subsequent ones, and the experimental arrangement will inevitably lead to the conclusion that they got in the Dunning-Kruger effect. But that's just because that's how math sort of works. And here's what I mean. One of the assumed premises that they went into with this discussion that they had here, and I think has been well demonstrated elsewhere, is that most people tend toward the average. And more importantly, most people tend to rank themselves higher than their peers on everything. One of the most often cited studies on this showed that 93% of drivers in America think that they are better than average. 93%.
Right.
That is almost all of them. As I know we've joked about on here. Like, the fact that I qualify this is always a joke, but like 93%. Now, presumably that does include some of the really good drivers and some really poor drivers, but 93% of drivers in America think they are better than average, which is mathematically impossible.
Right.
Like, most people will be around average and some people will be on the extremes, but most people believe that they're above average. But that's a really important initial starting point for the conclusions that they reached in this article.
Yeah, absolutely. They created 1,154 fake students with a range of scores from low to high, then assigned random numbers as confidence ratings, simply arranging the students on a graph, and then arranging the randomly assigned confidence scores. The bottom performance would have confidence scores higher than the average by a similar range as the original study, while the top performers have confidence scores lower than the average by a similar range as the original study. The fact that the estimated scores were higher was just an artifact of the math that their scores were lower, so most numbers would be higher, and the same is true for the top performers. So remember, all of that's fake, but the math just worked out as it was.
Yeah, so basically just if they took, I actually think they did sort of a linear progression of like, we're just going to make up, there's over 1,000 fake students. We're just going to make up scores from them that mostly go from the low end to the high end. And then we're going to plot them so that we group the lowest quartile of performers, then the mid-low, mid-high, and the highest quartile of performers. And then we're just going to show where the confidence intervals fall. But again, those confidence rankings were totally random, literally completely and totally random.
Right.
But it just so happens to be that most numbers are lower than were higher than the lowest numbers, and most numbers are lower than the highest numbers. And so that meant that even if you sort of spread out the distribution of confidence scores, well, that would be all over the place, it would look like the people on the low end were overestimating themselves just because they tended toward the middle. And the same thing is true for the highest performers. It would look like they underestimated themselves just because they tended toward the middle.
Right.
And so they were sort of saying it's just kind of how math works, that would be the case, that maybe their own self-evaluation isn't like that off of where they really are.
Right, absolutely. Now, in a non-experimental arrangement, a professor gave a scientific literacy test to some students. Only 16% of the lowest performers overestimated their performance, while 4% actually underestimated their performance. About 8% of the lower performers were pretty good at estimating how well they did. So that's, I mean, it's not experimental, but it still tells you a little bit about kind of like what the actual, like kind of what's happening in a real world scenario.
Yeah, exactly. So while like most of the people who performed low actually did get pretty close on estimating how they did.
Right.
Some were significantly over, some were significant, but importantly, some were significantly under. Like the lowest performers actually thought they did worse than they really did. Also happened, but most of them were kind of close to their actual performance. And essentially, what they're arguing then is like maybe they were actually fairly good. But again, we have those law of averages here that it tends to that they're just skewed toward the middle. Essentially, the case I think that they're making is that maybe the most robust interpretation of the evidence that we have as far as it relates to the Dunning-Kruger effect is that most people think that they're better than average. Maybe that's sort of the conclusion we can draw from this.
Sure.
Or maybe they're sort of close-ish to average, but mostly better than average. Perhaps we're too confident in the linear relation of unintelligent but confident to intelligent but unconfident, or maybe we were underconfident in how much we actually know.
Oh, look at that. Our heads totally exploded because it's funny thinking that like the original idea Dunning-Kruger effect may have overestimated the effect of the Dunning-Kruger effect.
That would be. And then there's a very common graph that people use when they're talking about the Dunning-Kruger effect that wasn't actually in the Dunning-Kruger effect. And what it is there's like a confidence scale and a percent correct, and it like peaks really high where they're like really confident, but their percentage is really low. And then it drops off as you learn more and more, but you get less and less confident.
Right.
And then it peaks back up again as you get more or as you learn more, and then you become more confident, but you never get quite as high as that, how confident you were to begin with when you knew nothing. And they call that Mount Stupid on the graph.
Yes.
But like, we don't know where the graph actually came from. Like, it's not from the original Dunning-Kruger article. We can't find the original source. So even that seems to be like kind of ironic that people use that to represent the Dunning-Kruger effect when they're like overconfident in that representation when it's not even from the actual study.
Right. It's so wild. I love it.
Anyway, we should probably wrap that up here. Thank you so much for listening and for joining us here. We appreciate you all being around and joining us on these trips down memory lane that we like to take. And so I'd just like to thank my group of people who helped make this happen. Thank you to my team, Shane and myself, do writing and fact checking. Our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson, and the person who stitches together all these old episodes with the new content is Justin, our audio producer extraordinaire.
Yes.
We do have some things to recommend, which we do every episode, but we did not do that, I believe, at the time that we recorded the original Dunning-Kruger episode. So we'll do that now. But first, as I mentioned, if you'd like to support us over on Patreon, you can get access to some behind the scenes content, bonus content, ad-free content, all that sort of thing. And I will read your name as part of the credits for helping make this little project of ours continue to happen. So a big shout out and thank you to Mike M, Megan, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, Ashley, Kiara, and Michelle for your ongoing and continued support. You are the bestest.
So great. We just adore you.
Thanks to everyone who is listening today. Thank you for recording with me today, Shane. Is there anything that you'd like to add or anything that I forgot before we get to some recommendations?
Nope. I feel good.
Recommendations.
Because I don't remember how long the original episode was, and I don't want to make this go too long, I'm going to be quick. I'm recommending a recent animated movie. This is Despicable Me 4, the fourth installment in the Despicable Me franchise. And it is a Despicable Me movie. It is everything you want from a Despicable Me movie and better than any Minions movie. It's cute, it's funny, it's silly, it's ridiculous. The animation has gotten very, very good. So if you're in for a fun, silly child sort of movie, Despicable Me 4 is quite good. So if you're interested, go check it out.
That sounds like a lot of fun. I've been wanting to see it and I have not seen it yet. So I'm going to recommend a food blog. And it is called The Conscious Plant Kitchen. The reason I am recommending this is because it is just a ton of free recipes. When you go on the website, like right now, I'm looking at a recipe for pumpkin energy balls, but they have just a ton of recipes on the website. If you are looking to do a vegan diet or certain types of diet, like egg-free, vegan, dairy-free, vegetarian, gluten-free, nut-free, grain-free, there's lots of different kind of It's a lot of baking, so a lot of pastries. There's flour, there's almond flour scones, there's pancakes, there's lentil cookies. There's a lot of really cool stuff on here. And if you just like baking, then I think it's probably worth checking out. I'm going to look at a couple different recipes on here and probably grab something like these protein biscuits that look pretty good. But there's vegan chocolate banana muffins. There's all kinds of stuff on there if you like that sort of thing. So,
Wow.
and everything looks really, really great on it. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. This is consciousplantKitchen.com.
Yes. That's it.
TheConsciousPlantKitchen.com. Okay. And then I recommended Despicable Me 4, the new kids movie. All right. I think that's all that I have then. Oh, if you'd like to tell us about anything that we added or got wrong in our new addition here to the Dunning-Kruger effect, you can reach out to us directly, info@wwd.podcast.com, or on the social media platforms. We look forward to your constructive criticism and heaping praise.
Yay.
But I think that's all that I have then. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.